Why do people hurt and kill each other? That is the question that we are still trying to answer. Now, epigenetics is the study of how environmental influences affect the expression of genes. This fuses nature and nurture. DNA, by the way, are molecules that contain your genetic blueprint like a cookbook, and genes are the individual recipes. They are pieces of your DNA that tell your body what traits to express. Old school genetics claim that your genes in your DNA are what they are, as if written in unerasable ink. Genes will express themselves in your physiology as they are genetically destined to, regardless of environment. But new school epigenetics claims that the genes in your DNA may be written in ink, but they are marked up in pencil, and environmental influences make up these pencil marks. These marks affect how your genes are expressed. Now, what's the difference between writing in pen versus pencil? Who did the writing in pen? And who's doing the writing in pencil? Now, epi means on or upon. Parents/DNA do writing in pen. Environment does writing in pencil. Now, what does this mean for our big question? This combines nature and nurture in a very powerful way. Epigenetics fully developed in the last 20 years, using longitudinal studies, which means over time. Richard Tremblay studied the development of aggressive kindergarten boys over time. Heightened physical aggression during early childhood correlates with antisocial behavior in adolescence and adulthood. Now let's look at some environmental factors. Old school theory. These are bad seeds, it's in their genes. The longitudinal work, however, shows environmental influences are directly relevant in explaining this behavior over the life course. Now let's talk more about studies. Studies demonstrated how nurturing factors affect DNA processes, methylation, that can influence genes relating to behavior, like putting pencil marks around the ink. Environmental forces influencing how genes will be expressed. Rat pups that received more nurturing, early attention from their mothers showed different genetic activity relating to how they responded to stress. Environment can influence genetic predispositions relating to stress. Methylation patterns different in nurtured monkeys compared to non-nurtured monkeys. Aggressive, that had been separated from their mothers. These epigenetic changes alter the expression of a gene important for regulating a certain brain chemical, one that, when out of balance, leads to increased aggression in humans. Regulation of a certain chemical influences by external forces. So what about humans? Tremblay found that compared to less aggressive subjects, long-time aggressors, in his longitudinal study, had a different methylation pattern in genes that controlled expression of a certain blood molecule. Now let's talk about some main ideas. Nurture affects nature, especially early nurturing. The link between childhood aggression and later aggression may be a reflection of these epigenetic changes. Nurture, genes, aggression throughout life. Simple. What would early nurturing look like for human beings? Physical contact, present parents, and a good social environment, substance, and shelter. What happens when you're stressed out? You have bodily changes like physical symptoms and anxiety, and you can have cognitive changes. Childhood abuse, neglect, loss, domestic violence, and family dysfunction produce abnormally prolonged stress responses in a young child's developing body. When these bodily, cognitive, and emotional responses are continually repeated and reinforced over sustained periods of time, this produces toxic stress. Jack Shonkoff. Experience gets into the brain as it's developing its basic architecture. Nurture affects nature. Let's talk about some childhood influences. The mother couldn't afford to keep her and had to find a cheap babysitter. The partner of the babysitter abused the 2-year-old. The example of sexually abused 2-year-old shows that these adverse experiences can produce aggression. Toxic stress can be neutralized through nurturing parenting. Many parents themselves have experienced toxic stress from their adverse experiences. They are often themselves abusive, neglectful, dysfunctional, because their past has taught them and rewired their brain to be that way. And poverty doesn't help. For example, that mom not being able to look after her daughter herself led to the bad situation. There are intergenerational roots of damage, and vulnerability runs deep. We need to change the question from what's wrong with the person to what happened to the person, and what's the best response. Hint. Punishment is usually not. Social context changes the architecture of the brain. Now, if we look at the brain real quick, we have the frontal lobe, which thinks rationally, towards the upper frontal part of the brain. Then we have that middle part, the limbic system, that's where there's more instinctive feeling, and the spinal cord, where messages enter. The limbic system is a primitive, breathing, fear response. The frontal lobe provides impulse control and governs executive functioning. For example, judgment, decision-making, and long-term planning. When the frontal lobe isn't functioning properly, the limbic system governs. The limbic system is physically closer to the rest of the body. The most vicious, impulsive criminals suffer from 1, a history of child abuse, 2, psychotic symptoms, especially paranoia, and 3, brain injuries. Let's begin with the history of child abuse. Abuse includes neglect. Children before 2 who are deprived of nurturing, which is known as a somatosensory bath, bodily sensory stimuli, have limbic regions with wiring that's less complex and dense. Such a person is literally lacking some brain organization that would allow him to make strong connections to other human beings. Abuse produces stress, which produces the hormone cortisol. Prolonged production of too much cortisol can become toxic. It eats away at the hippocampus, which is vital for emotional regulation. Nurture affects nature. Next, we're going to look at psychotic symptoms. Psychosis is a perceptual break from reality. It involves delusions, which is the false, fixed belief, and/or hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that don't exist. Violence is associated with paranoid forms of psychosis, perceiving incorrectly that someone is out to harm you. Psychosis can be induced by stress. Again, nurture affects nature. Next, we're going to look at brain injuries. The frontal lobe injuries can lead to disinhibition, like with Jonathan Pincus's tapping test. If you can't ignore the tapping, if you can't screen out environmental annoyance and stimulus, then you probably can't ignore being jostled in a bar either. It's living life with a hair trigger. Nurture affects nature. According to Jonathan Pincus and Dorothy Lewis, the most vicious, impulsive criminals suffer from the terrifying synergy of these three factors working together. Aggression and violence are not the result of health and strength. They are the result of damage and impairment. So let's take a look at our original question. Why do people hurt and kill each other? The criminal justice system treats people like rational human beings. Next, we're going to look at the law. Rationality. The idea of objective, impartial rationality is central to the justice system. The law portrays its decision makers, judges, jurors, as rational actors. Punishment. The law also operates on ideas its citizens are rational, and if they don't, they are punished. Rational choice theory is the theory that people calculate the benefits of criminal violence outweigh the costs. There's an assumption that people are rational or reasonable in making decisions. They determine all costs and benefits, according them their proper weight, and carrying out the comparison. The law tries to make it irrational for people to commit crimes. Let's look at penal sanctions. The main purpose of penal sanction in America is deterrence, making the costs of committing crime outweigh the benefits. The law sets the costs higher than what reasonable people will perceive to be the benefits. Another purpose of penal sanctions is retribution, punishing the guilty for harming society, involving expressing disapproval and condemnation, making the criminal atone for his wrongdoing, making him pay, and indulging in a sense of vengeance. The law brings the hammer down on people for making irrational decisions. If you're going to be unreasonable, you're going to pay. There are real-world costs and moral costs to crime. The two justifications for penal sanctions come from very different sources: Enlightenment-era rational thought and pre-Enlightenment theological thought. Enlightenment thought brought into account the costs and the benefits. Theological thought brought retribution into the matter. Both ideas merge together smoothly in America's justice system. The law expects rational behavior of its citizens and uses penal sanctions to both deter and punish people for deviating from the straight and narrow. Let's look at cases. Criminal prosecutions are different from civil lawsuits. Prosecutions are crimes versus the state versus a defendant. Civil cases are disputes between private parties, a plaintiff and a defendant. Penalties for defense in losing criminal cases include probation, prison, and the death penalty. Penalties for the defense in losing a civil case is giving over money or property, being forced to do or not do something. The key difference: criminal liability means the loss of liberty and sometimes even the loss of life. Case number 5. Rodney Piers was charged in Louisiana with negligent homicide. Case number 5. Rodney Piers was charged in Louisiana with negligent homicide for the shooting death of 16-year-old Yoshi Hattori. Piers was found not guilty based on self-defense. Both parties agreed on the facts. The case hinged upon the interpretation of those facts and what was in the mind of Rodney Piers, and whether this was a reasonable state of mind for a common citizen confronted by the same set of circumstances. There's a central question: would a reasonable person believe that their home was being invaded? Piers did not have to be factually correct in his beliefs to be found guilty. His beliefs just had to have reasonable grounds. They have opposing perspectives on if the conduct is reasonable or rational, not the facts. What's rational isn't always clear. Contempt and reasonableness is often an explicit issue in defense to homicide. Let's look at defense functions. Defendants, in theory, enjoy the presumption of innocence, which goes back to Roman times. The defense's main job is to hold prosecution to its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt to show that a reasonable person would doubt that the defense committed the crime. The reasonable doubt standard reflects the law's expectation that jurors will deliberate with reason. In theory, the defense doesn't have to prove anything, it just needs to raise doubt, reasonable doubt. There are certain defenses, affirmative defenses, that do require affirmative proof. This proof must also lie beyond a reasonable doubt. There are two things. 1. Alibi. Evidence of why the defendant couldn't have committed the crime. 2. Justification. Defendant's conduct is justified because it was intended to avoid a harm greater than the one committed. Public duty and necessity, and weighing component is rationality. Thank you.